I was in Brussels 3 weeks ago for a closed-door meeting with European finance officials. The topic was Russia sanctions. One senior official said, "We thought freezing their assets would bring them to their knees. Instead, we have created a monster we cannot control." He was right, because what Europe did with Russian assets has triggered a chain reaction that will reshape the global financial system. Let me tell you what they are not reporting, and why this $105 billion seizure might be one of the greatest strategic blunders in financial history. On February 26, 2022, the European Union froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Unprecedented. Never before had Western nations seized the sovereign assets of a major power. For 2 years, those assets sat frozen. Europe debated what to do. Then, in May 2024, they made a decision. They would not confiscate the principal, but they would seize the interest earnings, approximately $3 billion per year, transfer it to Ukraine as military aid. When I heard this, I knew it was catastrophic, because you cannot partially steal someone's money and expect no response. Europe thought they found a compromise. Keep the principal, take the profits, perfect middle ground. But there is no middle ground in financial warfare. You either respect property rights or you do not. Let me tell you what Russia did in response, and why it changes everything. Within 48 hours of the EU announcement, Moscow issued a decree. Any European company with assets in Russia was now subject to mirror retaliation. If the EU was seizing $105 billion in accumulated Russian assets and interest, Russia would seize an equivalent value in European holdings. The list of vulnerable companies is staggering. Volkswagen has $3.5 billion in Russian assets. Raiffeisen Bank has $2.8 billion. Danone has $1.2 billion. Societe Generale, Unilever, Shell, BP. The total European corporate exposure in Russia exceeds $200 billion. Russia is not threatening to seize all of it. They are being surgical. They are targeting the exact amount Europe took. $105 billion. No more, no less. Perfect mirror retaliation. Now here is where it gets interesting. European governments are panicking because their big corporations are screaming. Volkswagen cannot afford to lose $3.5 billion. Raiffeisen would face insolvency. These companies have shareholders. They have employees. They have political connections. So European governments are stuck. They took Russian state assets to fund Ukraine, but now their own private sector is being sacrificed to pay for it. And those companies are demanding their governments make a deal. But here is what makes this truly brilliant. Russia is not just seizing assets randomly. They are being selective. They are targeting companies from countries that pushed hardest for asset confiscation. German companies, French companies, Austrian companies, the very nations that championed this policy, are now paying the price. Meanwhile, companies from countries that were hesitant about sanctions, Hungary, for example, they are mysteriously being left alone. This creates political divisions within Europe. It rewards countries that showed restraint. It punishes those that were most aggressive. This is strategic genius. Russia is not fighting Europe as a unified bloc. They are exploiting the cracks, turning member states against each other. And it is working. Let me tell you what this means for the broader financial system, because this goes far beyond one dispute between Russia and Europe. For 75 years, the Western financial system operated on a fundamental principle. Property rights are sacred. When you deposit money in a Western bank, when you hold assets in a Western jurisdiction, those assets are yours. Governments might tax them, might regulate them, but they cannot simply take them. That principle died in February 2022, and it was buried in May 2024. Now every central bank on earth is asking, if they did it to Russia, could they do it to us? The answer is obviously yes. I have spoken with central bank governors from Asia, Africa, Latin America. Every single one is reviewing their reserve holdings. Every single one is asking, how much of our wealth is vulnerable to Western seizure? The answer terrifies them. Most central banks hold reserves in dollars and euros, denominated in Western currencies, held in Western banks, all subject to Western jurisdiction. So what are they doing? Diversifying, quietly, methodically, reducing dollar and euro holdings, increasing gold reserves, exploring bilateral currency arrangements, building payment systems that bypass Western infrastructure. This is the real cost of the asset seizure, not the $105 billion Europe took, but the trillions of dollars in central bank reserves that will flee Western jurisdictions over the next decade. Because trust, once broken, cannot be restored. Let me give you concrete examples of what is happening right now. Saudi Arabia is negotiating yuan-denominated oil sales with China. The UAE is building gold-backed settlement systems. India is trading with Russia in rupees. Brazil is settling trade with China in national currencies. These are not experiments. These are operational systems, and they are growing. Every month, more trade happens outside the dollar system. Every month, more central banks diversify away from Western assets. Europe thought they were punishing Russia. What they actually did was accelerate the decline of Western financial dominance. They proved to the world that Western assets are not safe, that property rights are conditional, that geopolitics trumps economics. And here is the cruelest irony. The $105 billion Europe is seizing, it will not change the outcome in Ukraine. $3 billion per year in military aid is meaningful, but it is not decisive. Russia's military budget is over $100 billion annually. Europe's contribution barely moves the needle. So Europe has sacrificed the credibility of its entire financial system for a tactical advantage that will not determine the war's outcome. It is strategic incompetence on a historic scale. Now let me tell you what Russia is really achieving with this response. It is not just about recovering their money. It is about establishing a new principle, the principle that financial weapons can be countered, that asset seizures invite retaliation, that the West's financial dominance is not absolute. Every country that watches this understands the lesson. If the West freezes your assets, you can freeze theirs. If they seize your property, you can seize theirs. The weapon can be turned around. This destroys the West's primary non-military leverage. For decades, the threat of financial sanctions was enough to bring countries in line. Comply or we cut you off. Obey or we freeze your money. That threat only works if countries believe they have no alternative. Russia is demonstrating the alternative. Fight back, build parallel systems, retaliate symmetrically, and suddenly the threat loses its power. I think back to that meeting in Brussels, that official's words, "We have created a monster we cannot control." He was not talking about Russia's military response. He was talking about the financial precedent. Because once you break the sacred rule that property rights are inviolable, you cannot put that genie back in the bottle. Every future conflict will now involve asset seizures. Every dispute will escalate to financial warfare, and Western financial centers will be the biggest losers. Think about what this means for London, New York, Frankfurt. These cities became global financial centers because they offered safety, neutral jurisdiction, rule of law, property protection. That was their value proposition. But if the UK can freeze Russian assets, if the EU can seize interest payments, if the US can weaponize the banking system, then these cities are no longer neutral. They are weapons. And smart money does not park wealth in a weapon. It finds safer ground. This is why we are seeing the rise of alternative financial centers. Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong. These cities are positioning themselves as truly neutral. They will not seize your assets for geopolitical reasons. They will not weaponize their financial systems. That neutrality is becoming their competitive advantage. Capital is already flowing. Chinese companies are moving headquarters to Singapore. Russian oligarchs are buying property in Dubai. Middle Eastern wealth is diversifying away from London. The geography of global finance is shifting, and Europe is accelerating this shift. Every day the asset seizure continues, more capital decides to leave. Not just Russian capital, Any capital that fears it might be next. Let me address the moral argument. They will say Russia invaded Ukraine. Asset seizure is justified as punishment. International law, humanitarian principles. I am not defending Russia's actions in Ukraine, but morality and finance operate on different timescales. You can win the moral argument today and lose the financial war tomorrow. The West weaponized its financial system for moral reasons. Russia responds with cold strategic calculation, and in the long run, strategy defeats morality. When India buys Russian oil, they are not endorsing invasion. They are protecting energy security. When Saudi Arabia sells oil in yuan, they are not rejecting Western values. They are diversifying risk. When Brazil settles trade in reais, they are choosing independence. Europe forced the world to choose between morality and self-interest. Most countries choose self-interest, not because they are immoral, but because they have populations to feed and economies to run. The asset seizure sounded righteous, it felt powerful, but it was strategically idiotic because it united everyone who fears Western financial power. It gave them a common cause, and it accelerated the very multipolarity the West claims to fear. Russia's response is not just about $105 billion, it is about demonstrating that financial empire is as vulnerable as military empire, that dominance has limits, that power invites resistance, and that the era of Western financial hegemony is ending not with submission, but with retaliation. I look at what is happening and I see the same pattern I have watched my entire career. Empires overreach. They weaponize their strengths. They assume their power is permanent. And then they discover that every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. Europe thought it was punishing Russia. Instead, it has punished itself. The $105 billion seizure will be remembered not as the moment Europe stood firm, but as the moment it broke the system that made its wealth possible. And Russia's response? That will be studied in strategy courses for generations, as the moment a sanctioned power proved that financial warfare cuts both ways, and that the empire's weapons can be turned against itself.